Hi everyone, how are you? Everybody good? First of all, let me start by saying, even though it's been a cold September so far, by Saturday it's going to be 85 again. So yes, things are improving a little bit. We're just 8 days now officially away from the start to fall, which we all know is a major transition season in weather. So we begin to get a little bit of a glimpse into what we're going to get for the winter and moving forward, how it's going to look in terms of snowfall. Obviously last year was very light in the snow department, and it may have been my favorite winter ever. Maybe not quite as exciting to forecast, but definitely easier to drive to work. So we'll talk about that coming up in just one moment. But obviously weather is the one thing when I get into work, whether the news is good or bad, whether there's something very important happening in the world or in the country, the weather is still one of the #1 things that people want to know. So when you turn on the news, you want to know, is it going to be nice? Can I go to work? What's going to happen? And for you guys, obviously looking forward, you're looking at crops, you're looking at different things. Of utmost import to you guys in many ways is the weather. So we'll talk about sort of what we're looking at moving forward, and I'll kind of talk about what I do as well. Because there are so many different avenues to meteorology. You can have someone working at the National Weather Service. They're doing day-to-day forecasting all the time. You can have someone working at the Climate Prediction Center, and all they do simply all day long is look forward. But while it's the same science, it's very different. For me, it's more what the guys at the Weather Service do. We look at our models, we look at what's going to happen for the day, and we look forward maybe about a week. I will tell you that the first couple of days were the closest. By the time we get to about 5 days out, we're still okay, but by that 6th and 7th day, it gets a little bit dicier. And I think it got to be that way because the 7-day forecast just sounded good looking forward for a week. But really, I think if you were to ask any meteorologist, we'd feel better doing like a 5-day forecast. It would be the most predictable. So in my business, you sort of start off in a small city. I don't know how it works for you all. Maybe you start off in a company, you know, running papers or something and work your way up. But for us, we have to start in a very small place and work our way up. So for me, my path has been from Parkersburg, West Virginia, tiny little market, all the way up to New York City, and then I had my daughter and came back here to Chicago. So I forecasted just about everywhere in the country. When I worked in Baltimore, they were trying a new concept. They were consolidating the news and the weather all from one location, and we would satellite the weather out. So it was a new concept. They thought they would save some money doing that, but it was very difficult because I had cities like Oklahoma City, Dayton, Rochester, New York, and if you think about that, you're going to end up with very different weather patterns in those places. Oklahoma City, you could have a tornado outbreak, while at the same time, you may have, you know, feet of lake effect snow in Rochester and Buffalo. So it was difficult. They stopped the whole idea, and now it's just back to the way you see it typically. So if you're in Chicago, you could watch me, or you could watch Cheryl or anybody in the Chicago stations, and so on and so forth. So while I was in Miami, I also worked for Good Morning America briefly, doing their weather, and then now I am a contributor oftentimes to CBS This Morning. I actually just got back from Dallas, Texas, covering Irma. I know it doesn't sound right. Should have been in Miami, right? Well, they actually sent me to Dallas in the event that the Miami station went entirely down, because at the time we were concerned it was going to be a Category 5 plowing into South Florida. Thankfully, that didn't happen. It was a Cat 4, though, over the Keys, and we'll sort of talk about that because we just had a story this morning as well that the citrus crop in Florida was really badly injured by the hurricane. Obviously, this year it's not looking so good due to it, but then looking forward, we don't know how many of those trees were damaged, and moving forward, that may be a big issue for the state of Florida, as it always would be. Okay, so my job on a day-to-day basis, I'm up at about 1:30 in the morning to get to work. Everybody looks at me funny. It is really early. We start at 4:30 in the morning, and then we go through 7. National show takes over after that. So what I do generally is day-to-day weather forecasting. So what you would turn on and see the forecast for today, tonight, and tomorrow, moving forward into the 7 days. We evaluate the radar, the satellites, and look at weather patterns moving across the country to see how they're going to impact our area. Obviously, as I was saying with Ryan, Lake Michigan can have a big impact clearly on our forecast patterns here in Chicago. We also obviously look at the radar and the satellite, helps you determine what's going to happen moving forward. And then they also have us acting as the station scientists. So even if my area of expertise is meteorology, If there's an earthquake, all of a sudden it's me. If there is a comet, it's me. And oftentimes that's not even something we're 100% familiar about, but I suppose they figure just because there's an ist at the end of our name that they can just fill in the front part. So that happens many times. Okay, so I kind of want to talk about hurricane season because as we go forward in the next few years, likely, climate change is playing a big part on the sea surface temperatures, which is going to feed these hurricanes and make them bigger and stronger systems. Now, the ties between climate change and effects on our weather on a day-to-day basis are not exactly there yet. We do know globally, though, that things are changing, right? The temperatures of the Earth are warming. We've had some of the warmest years on record globally in the past few years. So even if we had a particularly cold winter, if you look at the entire globe, it's been warmer than average and trending that way now for several years. So what that does with hurricanes, they need a couple of different things. They need the atmosphere to be pretty steady. They don't want a lot of twist and spin in the upper atmosphere. If you do that, it can rip up the storms as they try to build. And they look for really warm sea surface temperatures. Oftentimes happens, if you'll see that first graph on the left there, happens usually about now. September 10th is the peak of hurricane season, and that's when we see everything blow up, really, because the sea surface temperatures are 90 degrees in some areas, and they've got a lot of fuel to act on. When we talk about these systems, something like an Irma and a Harvey, looking at those categories, and it may not make a whole lot of sense, so here you go, in case there's another, which there very well could be. We're tracking Jose right now, and that one looks like it'll probably stay out over the waters of the Atlantic, but you got a category 1, that's going to cause some damage. That's maybe what Irma was by the time it got to Georgia, northern Florida. But as you go down here, you can see that the damage changes drastically. That's going to impact so many things in terms of crops, in terms of structures, in terms of just general flooding and storm surge. So it changes a lot depending on the status of the storm. So for a while, Irma was the strongest storm on record in the Atlantic Basin. 185 mile an hour winds. We're talking gusting into the 200s. And that is absolutely devastating. Those are the pictures you're seeing out of the Caribbean, St. Thomas, St. Martin's, Barbuda, all those areas dealing with that. So we start with Harvey because that one, continental U.S. record for rainfall. This is something that I think we're going to see moving forward. When you get these bigger systems, oftentimes they're going to create a bigger situation for folks on the ground. Now this one was a category 4, but it got stalled out because of the weather patterns, and it just sat and it rained. And we're talking 50 plus inches of rain in Houston. Everyone saw the footage of that, the flooding that it caused. And obviously for Houston, but then continuing up into parts of Louisiana and Arkansas. And this was the first Cat 4 that we've had hit the U.S. in a while. But when you have these super warm sea surface temperatures, you get another system, and then boom, you get an Irma. And this one is the one that obviously we were just tracking recently. Winds to 185, again, as I said. So the strongest hurricane on record. These things are going to happen more with time here. As you get warmer temperatures, you get warmer sea surface temperatures, it's just more fuel. It would be the difference between giving your car the regular or the premium. It's going to act better with the premium. It's going to be a better machine with the premium. So that's the same thing with these systems, and that's the sort of thing that we may see moving forward. So halfway through the season this year, the Hurricane Center said, okay, we made our prediction. They do that oftentimes before the season starts. But then you run into everything that was happening and looking at the sea surface temperatures, and here we go with an update. And so they now estimate 14 to 19 named storms, hurricanes 5 to 9, that would mean any hurricane, and then of that, major hurricanes would be category 3, 4, or 5, because those do the most damage, the most devastation. And they did update that as well, and obviously we've already had 2, and 2 that landfell across parts of the U.S. is something we don't have very often at all. Okay, so anyone who's looking for long-term forecasting, there are a couple really good places to turn. Some people I know look at the Farmer's Almanac. I can't speak to the science on that one. Oftentimes we kind of go, okay, they want us to do a story on the Farmer's Almanac. We do a quick story on it and move forward, because the science is there more with someone like the Climate Prediction Center. So they're looking at El Nino, La Nina, how that's going to impact the weather patterns. moving forward. So Climate Prediction Center is a wonderful place to look. If you just stick that in Google, you're going to find all kinds of different information looking forward at the precipitation, the temperatures, and what the weather patterns generally are going to be. So right now, moving into this winter, initially, we had a very small, very weak El Nino. At this point, it looks like it's just going to be pretty static. So we have neither a La Nina or an El Nino. And at this point, that means we should have pretty typical conditions for winter. And that may mean a little bit warmer for us as well as we move forward. So if you want to talk about 1 month temperature predictions for the U.S. right here, Florida obviously a little bit warmer. You've got a core of cold across parts of our area, stretching up to the northeast, down through most of the plain states and down into Texas. So we're talking about temperatures cooler than average moving forward, and this would be just for the next month. And in the west, incredibly warm temperatures. So they may see more wildfires in the west over the next few months. Precipitation should be just about equal for us, so or even below average. If you look at that center of the country where so many things grow, corn, wheat, things like that, looks like we're not going to have a lot of precip over the course of the next month or so, while in the east we're looking at more precipitation, perhaps due in part to some of the tropical systems that we're seeing making landfall there. 3 months out, so now we're talking about the winter. Most of the United States should be warmer than average, with Alaska well above average. A couple of years back, we had that situation. You may remember the polar vortex years of a couple of years back. Let me just fix that misnomer a little bit. The polar vortex sits over the North Pole, and it rotates around. It's a tight circulation above the poles. So what happens is when it weakens a bit, warmer temperatures often create that. When it weakens, it'll send a blast of energy southward. So that little sort of looks like a little tongue of energy. The jet stream takes a dive, and it allows that cold air to come down here. It's not actually the polar vortex. So if you hear someone say the polar vortex is in Chicago, that is not really correct. The polar vortex has sent energy in our direction. That energy oftentimes is bitterly cold. So you're talking about an Arctic air mass. That's 100% related, but it's not actually the polar vortex. So if anyone says that moving forward, now you know. Polar vortex stays put. It just sends energy in our direction. But it does not look like over the next 3 month period we're going to see much of that. 3 month precipitation here, we're likely looking at a bit of a rainier setup in the southeast, moving into Texas, and the rest of the country, we're looking at equal chances. So it's difficult to forecast long-range weather because the issue now is that we're seeing big fluctuations in climate, big fluctuations in weather patterns. Things aren't quite as predictable as they used to be. So we're seeing many issues with moving forward because a lot of stuff is changing. So a while back, CBS News had me go to a climate change event in Washington. They don't have a meteorologist on staff in New York, and they use me pretty often. So they had me go interview President Obama on climate change. Interesting story in that, though. They flew me out to the White House for CBS News, but this was the first time that they'd been able to talk to President Obama in a while. He hadn't been granting one-on-one interviews. And I think he thought he would get a softball by saying, okay, each network can send a meteorologist. He's figuring he's not going to get crazy questions or political questions. You'll get more along the lines of weather questions and climate questions. Well, and that's what I thought I would be asking as well. Until the network got a hand on me and they said, okay, so Megan, it's supposed to be about climate change, but what we would really like you to do instead is ask him about the Nigerian girls in Boko Haram. I'm going to want you to ask about Secretary Shinseki and the Veterans Administration, and I'm going to want you to ask about the Keystone Pipeline. And here I am like, because that's not my world, you know? I mean, I chose the weather for a couple reasons. I like the science of it, but I'm also a happy person and not real confrontational. So that was a little difficult for me because all of a sudden here I am one-on-one with President Obama, and all of a sudden I have to ask questions that I know he does not want to answer. And they're very good at dodging, by the way, because I didn't get my Keystone Pipeline question answered at all. Usually you only have about 5 minutes in these type of interviews, and if you get 5 minutes, that's actually a really long time. So we sat through all the climate prediction things, though. We sat through all the discussions with the scientists and moving forward how the weather is going to be impacted by climate change and not necessarily what we can do about it, but more so along the lines of what we can expect. When you're counting on a winter to bring a little bit of snow and perhaps a bit of rain and temperatures on average, you operate one way. But when things are fluctuating like this, it changes the whole ball game in the weather department. So things are not the same. You can't count on things being like they used to be, really. So possible changes from climate change looking forward. It's a longer growing season, so I suppose that could be a good thing, middle part of the country. We're looking at changes in precipitation patterns. So I was showing you that the southeast may be a bit wetter, and we've got equal chances right now of the rest of the country seeing more or less precipitation. Again, it's tough to pinpoint climatologically what we're going to see, and long-range forecasts are difficult. But more droughts, more heat waves, more intense hurricanes, and sea level rises to a certain degree. And I won't speak to that because I don't do hydrology. There's a whole other department on that one. But I explained the hurricane situation. That's along the lines of the warmer sea surface temperatures, less things to interrupt these circulations when they really get going. Droughts and heat waves, that's something we're going to see as well. Even if we're having really cold temperatures here in the Midwest, chances are they're going to have a lot of heat in the West Coast because everything is connected globally. There's all kinds of cells that are in place across the world that are connected. So if we see a system here and it's a major storm system, it's eventually going to chug out over the Atlantic, and eventually it's going to impact the UK in some way. There was a day that CBS asked me to be their expert on something called the black tide in England. Well, I don't work in England, clearly. I'm in Chicago, and I'm like, what the hell is the black tide? I didn't know. So I got on the phone and I called the UK Met Office, and I spoke with a meteorologist there. His name was Alexander Burkhill, and I said, Alex, they want me to talk about the black tide, so what is it? And he said, what? And he didn't know what it was either. Here's the problem. A lot of times, you'll get the media, and I am part of it, it will get a name, and it's not even something that's scientifically correct. That happens oftentimes. So we figured out that what it was a major storm system that had moved across the Atlantic from our neck of the woods and ended up out there. And what it was doing was creating these massively high swells. They were having all kinds of flooding, coastal flooding, all along the coast of Ireland, all along the coast of Scotland and England. So I was able to explain it once we figured out what in the God's green earth they were talking about. So everything is connected globally, and when that happens, if it's incredibly cold here, it's got to be incredibly warm somewhere else because the jet stream is driving these temperatures. And if you were to draw a jet stream and it looks like this, the West Coast is right here and you've got it looking like this, that puts it in what's called a ridge. A ridge is going to allow for warm temperatures and drier air. But where there's a ridge, there's got to be a trough that follows. It's like if you took a string and you went like this, right? The string would go like this. So where it goes up, somewhere else it must go down. So if it's incredibly cold here, chances are in the west it's warm. If it's cold in the west, chances are it's fairly warm in our area or in the East Coast. So that does happen, and you can pretty much predict that as well. And eventually some weather system will come and it will knock the pattern back and move the warmer air east and so on and so forth. So there were a couple of times during the winter of the polar vortex, or the impacts from the polar vortex, where we actually had temperatures that were colder than Siberia. Alaska was warmer than Atlanta. And these sorts of things can and do happen. Happened a little bit last year, if you'll remember. Early in the winter, we got a real blast of very, very cold air. And then the rest of the winter was relatively mild. So looking forward, at this point, it looks like it may be warm, at least to start the winter. So taking us out the next 3-month period, so all the way through September, October, November, and into December, very mild conditions. Okay, so this is what we expect to see moving forward. I showed you what we're going to have when you look at essentially the next 1 month to 3 months out. The Northeast, we're looking in the years to come at heat waves, heavy downpours, sea level rises may be an issue. So that may be an issue with more heat in the Northeast. We're talking about the Northwest. They're going to see issues with sea level rise and erosion, things of that nature. The southeast, obviously, when you're talking about Florida, when Irma came on shore, you had that massive hurricane, and the storm surge is upwards of 15 feet across parts of Marco Island and the Keys, and they're 5 feet above sea level. That's entirely inundated. So that's what happens there. I don't know if a lot of people understand storm surge. When you look at the situation of a hurricane rotating counterclockwise, when it makes a landfall, where it's rotating the winds inland, so where you're getting those winds hitting the shore, what it's doing is taking all of that water and piling it up on the shoreline and pushing it inland. So the stronger the hurricane, the more water it can pile up. The more water it can pile up, the farther it's going to go inland. Now, if you're putting that on shore and you're 50 feet above sea level, you maybe are right. The immediate shoreline may have an issue, but when you're 3 to 5 feet above sea level, it's all the way across. So storm surge usually causes the most deaths in any landfalling tropical system. But this time around, obviously, from Harvey at least, it wasn't that. It was the flooding that came in the wake of that. So that may be an issue for the southeast. The Midwest, we're looking at extreme heat and at extreme cold, too. A lot of times I'll get emails from people or tweets or pick your social media, that just because it's cold, we can't be experiencing any sort of climate change. But really what it is extreme shifts, extreme changes, whether it's cold or warm in any direction is what we're talking about there. And so through my forecasting from different areas of the country, there are different problems everywhere you go. There are different things that people are concerned about. When I worked in New York, it was nor'easters. What would that do to the coastline? When I was forecasting for Oklahoma City, it was obviously tornadoes. Vegas, it was the desert heat. And then here, we have to worry about Lake Michigan in large part. So that will factor in. Every area has its specific entity that will factor in to change the forecast. Lake Michigan changes our forecast a little bit. If you're in California, it's going to be impacted a lot by the Pacific Ocean. Here, if it's warmer, if the water is colder than the air, if the air is warmer than the water, when you get that wind traveling over the colder seas, and it's going to pick up the potential for lake effect. So lake effect happens in the winter for us when it's colder, moving over the warmer waters. And that's our big factor, obviously. So I suppose if anyone has any questions, we can do that. Again, I've worked pretty much everywhere, and I know you guys have issues in terms of what it's going to be across the Plains states and many other areas. So does anybody have any questions? Yeah?
Over the next couple months, obviously Houston is devastated, Florida's devastated, and you're predicting more rain. How much is that going to slow down the building of all the new infrastructure? Because obviously in order to tear things up and build things up, if it's raining every day, it's hard to get that stuff done.
Yeah.
You're saying there's going to be an overall amount of increased rainfall?
Yes, increased rainfall is predicted at this point for Texas and for much of the southeast, which would include Florida. So in Florida, rebuilding is going to have to happen on a large scale in the Keys. There, they've got the Miami-Dade building codes. I don't know if you're familiar with that. After Hurricane Andrew in 1992, they realized that things weren't built well enough for them to withstand these Category 4, Category 5 hurricanes. So they started building better buildings, thicker buildings. If you look at the walls out of Miami Beach, newer construction, so anything after 92, the walls are super thick and they've built it to hurricane codes. So they do a better job. And if you'll look at what happened across the Caribbean where the infrastructure is not as good, it's even more devastated than it is across parts of South Florida. But yeah, they will have more rain there. And any additional rain on top of what they've already had for areas like Texas is going to be a big factor because the ground is still saturated there, flooding is still happening.
I have actually two questions.
Sure.
One's a journalist question and one's a scientist question.
Okay.
The journalist question is, have you ever reported from the scene of a hurricane, and if so, what do you do to prepare? And the scientist question is, when you're forecasting and thinking about forecasting, do you ever really kind of look back and as a comparison at things such as soil core samples or ice core samples, things of that nature,
right,
in order to go back and have something to compare in order to forecast what's going on in the future?
We don't, in what I do on a day-to-day basis, we look at the forecast models looking forward. We don't probably get that in-depth because what we're doing is not on that bigger scale. We're just trying to get everybody today, tonight, tomorrow, and through the 7-day forecast. So we primarily work on that. Oftentimes we'll mention looking forward, but when you're talking about looking back, for us it's more of looking at a historical perspective. Maybe we'll say, okay, you know, we're expecting more snow than what we had when Lakeshore Drive was closed down. We don't really look much deeper than that because when we're forecasting and presenting the weather, or the news for that matter, we're doing it for people who are, chances are, getting ready in the morning. They're not sitting down to really study and pay that much attention. I hate to say that, but people are just trying to get ready, get out the door, get their kids ready, and sort of move forward. So while I wish we could look deeper into that stuff forecasting, it's more a day-to-day question and answer period for us. And then in terms of the hurricane forecasting, I've been lucky enough for the most part to be in studio during hurricanes. I actually worked in Miami during the 2004-2005 hurricane season. So you may remember Katrina and Rita and Wilma and Ivan and Jean and Charlie. My first day on the air was actually Hurricane Jean, and I had literally just moved to Miami, and I think I was like 22, so I was real lucky to get this job to begin with, and then I get there and there's a hurricane barreling down. I didn't even know the names of the counties yet, because you learn that through time, so I remember being a little overwhelmed, but stuck in studio primarily. And after 04 and 05, our chief meteorologist came up to me and he said, you know, Megan, I think you've had more experience in the last 2 years than I've had in my 25 years. Because prior to that, they'd had maybe, you know, a tropical system or two. We were on 12 on, 12 off coverage for literally probably most of those hurricane seasons. Hurricane season runs for June 1 through November 30th. So we're not done with this one yet. And I think it was 05, we got all the way through the list of names, all the way down to Z, and started back over with the Greek alphabet. So that was a big season. I have reported outside from blizzards and also from nor'easters and things of that nature, though. And to prepare for that, you got to have every kind of gear that you could possibly imagine. And you got to have a good photographer and pray to God that they're not whiny, because that can get real old in the live truck for hours. My best story, though, in terms of covering storms, I was in New York, and I was 9 months pregnant, and here comes this giant blizzard, but I'm doing the weather, so I'm hoping I'm in studio, but nope. They send me out, and they send me out to stand in New Jersey for 8 hours in the blizzard on February 10th. And this thing buried New York City, it buried New Jersey. We're talking like 18 inches of snow. So I made it through that day. The following day, February 11th, and I go out and I'm like, please God, don't send me out again. But apparently they wanted to. So they sent me out again with my yardstick, and I'm tromping through the snow, and I'm measuring my snow, and I remember it was 18 inches of snow, and I did my live shot, and I got back in the live truck, and then right away went into labor. So they had to drive me literally from the live truck to the hospital. Yeah. Baby born New Jersey. Yeah, it was a Jersey baby. Yep, it was my 7-year-old. So that's an interesting story, because my business is interesting. It's one where I think a lot of times to people it looks like, it's kind of fun. Maybe standing out in that hurricane is fun, but it's really anything but. I have friends who were stuck in Irma and Harvey. I have a friend, Chris Gutierrez, actually used to be our morning anchor here in Chicago, went back to Texas. He was reporting on Harvey from Texas. And they were in a boat trying to cover the hurricane and ended up saving, I don't know how many people. He was doing Facebook Live, and here they are, and they come across somebody, and they literally need help. So at some point, you have to draw that line between reporting the news and sort of becoming the news a little bit. And I think that happens when you run into those situations like a hurricane, like a blizzard, these things, because human needs come in. There's zero politics involved when you get to something like a Harvey and something like an Irma. That's why we see everybody coming together, and all the presidents together, the living presidents working together, hopefully, to try to help for relief for these people, because we're talking about a lot of those folks across Texas with no flood insurance, because it's not included if you're not in a flood zone. Many times you don't have flood insurance, but with 50 inches of rain, everywhere is a flood zone. So that'll be interesting to see how they hash that out moving forward. Anybody have any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, you were saying that the polar vortex sends energy.
Yeah.
And I always think of energy as warm, but it was cold. So
Right.
what's the translation to layman's terms
Okay.
of sending energy
All right.
from the polar?
So let's pretend like you've got this rotation up on the poles, right? So the air's rotating around and it's sort of stuck. There's like a little shield up there that's got it stuck. If something, and you know how if you were to spin something around, if you were to spin a string around, it'll stay nice and taut going around, but if you slow down, the string kind of flops down. All right, so what happens is you slow that rotation down a little bit and give a little weakness to it. It's going to send a lobe of, you could call it air, you could call it energy. It's going to send a lobe of air south. And when it displaces that air south, that air is coming from the polar vortex. So that's cold air. We're talking about Arctic air that then displaces south. So in weather terms, we call it energy a lot of times. Really, if you're thinking about a cold front coming through, what you're doing is replacing the warm air with cold air. And a lot of times that's why we see thunderstorms when you see a cold front coming through, because it's almost like a cold wedge of air coming and pushes that warmer air north. Well, as air rises, it's going to reach its condensation point. You're going to see clouds develop, and if it's a strong enough lift on it, you then get showers, maybe you get storms, maybe you get tornadoes. So it's all really how the energy changes. Everything's about energy. Does anyone know who Michio Kaku is? No? He's a physicist at, okay. He's a physicist and he's brilliant. He's written all kinds of books and we don't study the same kind of science. I am nothing compared to him in any way, shape, or form. But we were both on CBS this morning one day in the green room, and he was supposed to talk about the polar vortex and I was supposed to talk about the polar vortex. In my mind, I thought two things. First of all, how are we both doing this and making two separate segments on it? And, oh Lord, he's going to make me look like an idiot. However, that was not the case because his conversation was more about energy. So when we talk about energy like that, it's all, if you have a giant Category 4, Category 5 hurricane, on all sides of it, it's beautiful weather because it sucked all the energy into the center of that storm. So you can think about weather that way, but with the polar vortex, it just sends a lobe of cooler air down. That cooler air then moves down here. It displaces the warmer air south, and you start to get those real cold temperatures. Yeah?
A quick question. How do meteorologists predict the path of hurricanes? Because this last one was pretty accurate,
Yeah.
more or less. And there seems to be something behind it, right?
Right, yeah, there is. There's a lot behind it. There are a lot of things that we look at. There's something called steering currents. So a high pressure system, when you're here in Chicago, would mean sunny skies. It means sinking air, and it creates almost sort of like that shield I was talking about around an area. It's not going to really allow for any storm development. But it can also steer something. So the Bermuda high was in place, and that's a high pressure. You've probably heard of the Bermuda high before, just in passing. That was locked in right there. So Irma couldn't go north because the high was steering it west. So the computer models are ingesting all this information, and they're doing a bunch of different equations and coming up with the forecast track. But what we do as meteorologists and for the Hurricane Center, you take into account what's going on in the atmosphere. Do you have a high pressure? Do you have a low pressure? Will there be a weakness in that high that will allow it to turn? You also have to look at different things that go on from the surface of the ocean up into the environment, because a lot of times it will provide some sort of friction that will break the system up a little bit. You also got to look at what it's moving over, because if you'll notice, when those systems move over a landmass, it provides friction and starts to rip up the storm. So if it goes over Cuba or Haiti and the Dominican Republic or the state of Florida, it's not going to be as strong as it was when it was moving towards. So these computer models take all that into account, as well as the sea surface temperatures, and there are a bunch of different models. We have the European model, we have the American model, we've got the WRF, all kinds of different models. And so the difficulty is figuring out which one of those is doing the best job. They don't all take it the same way. Have you guys seen the spaghetti models before? You probably have. You know what I'm talking about, where they show the lines and there's 14 lines and they're all doing this, and they go from basically North Carolina all the way down to the Keys. Well, at some point, the Hurricane Center and meteorologists look at all those models, and you look and you see, okay, which model's been doing the best with the storm so far? And at some point, you sort of zero in on one and go with it. The Hurricane Center forecast that you'll see us use on TV is the center, generally the consensus of all those models. And that's where that center track is. And it's really important never to pay attention to the center track anyway, because a hurricane, in this instance with Irma was, 70 miles from the center in all directions, hurricane force winds. So it's not just that center of that track anyway. Now you got 140 miles of wide, and then you have tropical storm force winds in addition to that. So really with hurricanes, anybody within that, some people call it the cone of error. People jokingly call it the cone of death because, you get scared that you're in it, sort of a thing. In Florida, everyone tracks along at home. We had to give the latitude and longitude when we were giving the forecast because people sit at home literally with their papers and they track it because it plays such a part in their lives. But the general consensus is to take all those models, and that's what the Hurricane Center goes with. You'll see it shift a lot, though. I mean, even within that, it's not a perfect science because the systems will make little wobbles. Maybe they stay over land longer than you thought. So it's tough, and they change a lot of times, and that makes it difficult, too, because in this instance, it was an East Coast storm or a West Coast storm, and that's not a very big shift in that track, but just a little shift made all the difference. If it had been a Cat 4 smacking into Miami, we'd talk about a very different situation right now. The Keys, it was horrible, and it was devastating to the Keys, but there's a lot less there, so.
So he kind of, he asked you the same question I was going to ask. I have two questions, though. So originally, it was showing it coming down the east, the U.S. model, right?
Yep.
So I have a place in West Palm Beach, so we're all freaking out, right?
Of course.
And all my friends from West Palm Beach were going to Naples for, because it was showing the east side,
Right.
So they
So
go
go
to
west.
Naples, and that was like a head-on hit, right? So what, the U.S. model versus the European. The European model, I found out, actually showed it going down the west coast when the U.S. model was showing it coming down the east coast.
That's right.
So I'm following the east coast going, well, this has got to be right. And sure enough, the European model was right. Is it correct?
That is correct. It's not always right, though. That's the problem.
No, I know. But it was
like,
right the last time, too,
yeah,
right?
You're right. And that's why the Hurricane Center, that cone or the
Yeah.
track, had it making a landfall anywhere from the East Coast through to the West Coast. Problem is, that's what they say. This is our margin of error for where the
Right.
center is going to come through. But when you're talking about a difference from, let's say, Houston to Beaumont,
Right.
okay. But this time it was East Coast, completely populated all the way up with tons of stuff and beachfront property, that kind of thing, or West Coast. Basically, I think it was a New York storm or or a Midwest storm. It seems like there's so many East Coast people on the East Coast and West Coast people on the West, but it really, because it was coming up from the south like that, and the peninsula is not very wide at that point, it made a big difference. And you're right, I know a lot of people as well who evacuated to the West Coast. We still own our condo in Miami, on Miami Beach in Surfside, and our renters had to evacuate and leave. I hope they did. But turns out they didn't probably have to.
Right. So my second question, I have a boat on Lake Michigan, and I noticed the water's up 2 feet this year, right? Do you see that continuing, a rise in the water in Lake Michigan?
Yeah, it has showed that for the last few years, and potentially that is going to continue. Some of the issues that will move forward, I think, is almost uncharted territory, really, because we don't know all the impacts that are going to happen from what's going on, from more extremes in the climate and from more changes in terms of how much precip we're seeing different places. We had a much warmer winter last year as well. So these things are going to change and fluctuate. But yeah, definitely over the last couple of years, it's been trending up a bit.
My question was very similar to yours, but Megan, you mentioned in your charting that because of climate change, we're going to see a wide range of risks around the Great Lakes. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
It's going to be a factor for us in terms of around our area. We may see more droughts, potentially. We could see very, very cold, very, very hot. For us, I think it's not as much of a matter of sea level rises and things that they're going to be concerned about along the East Coast and on the West Coast, but more in enormous fluctuations, very, very cold, very, very hot. And then when you get big fluctuations like that, you also get more storms. So potentially more active severe weather seasons. Right now we look at the core of Tornado Alley, and that's going to be somewhere down around Kansas, and it's going to stretch up into Iowa and, including Texas. But as we move forward, if we're seeing these massive shifts like that too, from hot to cold, we could potentially see much more in the way of severe weather up here. And you'll see that change. I mean, the peak of our severe weather season is May, really is May, and then there's a little secondary maximum that happens in October. And but obviously, any month of the year, we can see those big and strong severe storms. And the issue is when you start to see things shifting like that, you could potentially see bigger, longer track tornadoes. Right now, if we get a tornado, it could be devastating, but the kind they get in Texas and Oklahoma is very different. We may potentially see more like that moving forward. Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's a chance that there'll be less and less fresh water as we go forward in time? Because there's, a lot of people who are talking about investment and all kinds of BTFs.
Right, fresh water in terms of lakes and things like that, or?
Yeah, fresh water in terms of for people to drink.
Geez, I hope not. What I think we're going to see, I mean, if we would see the continuation of those really warm temperatures like that, I think all bets are off in terms of what we may see, because sea levels are going to rise. I don't know that it would change the fresh water. We're still going to see our weather patterns continuing. We're still going to see showers and storms and things like that to continue the water cycle. So I don't know necessarily that that would happen, but I think it's a continuing study for many people. I mean, there are people who just study the effects on climate change on certain entities, but I think, kind of all bets are off. When I was at that climate change survey that we did, the book is this thick, and that was just one study. So, and they don't know. That's the problem. We don't 100% know. It's an inexact science moving forward. It's an inexact science, to be completely honest, from day to day. And we were talking about the difference between picking up your cell phone and getting your forecast and maybe listening to a meteorologist, whether you're looking at the Weather Service page or not. In fact, if you're in a hurry and you don't have time to watch somebody on TV, I would suggest the Weather Service anyway. Or if you're looking at the forecast moving forward for somewhere else, maybe the Plains states or somewhere that you're looking for trading purposes, the National Weather Service is always going to give you the best information, because these are scientists that are doing nothing but studying that particular area. For instance, our Weather Service office for Chicago is based out of Romeoville, and all they have is our area. So all day long, all they do is look at the hydrology, the climate, the temperature fluctuations, the forecast moving forward just for our area. You got Miami, they have Miami and the Keys. That's it. You got New York, they've got just the tri-state area. So if you're looking for a forecast, a lot of times people try to go other places. I would go right to the Weather Service. And if you click on the discussion, there's a discussion at the bottom of their page. And you gotta wade through weather lingo in large part, but it will tell you a lot about looking forward for the next week or 2 weeks. If you don't have time, if you're already at the office and you don't have time to watch somebody, that would be my suggestion. They're great, and they do spend all the time. I mean, when I do national stuff for CBS This Morning, you can't get in depth with every area of the country because it's too big. There's just not enough time to look at all the models for every city. But if you simply pick up the phone, and I've called the Weather Service office a lot of times in different parts of the country, and they're always very helpful. But their pages will tell you a lot of information. There's also the climatology there. So if you're looking, you want to know about, let's say, Omaha, surrounding areas, you'll have the climatology looking at the averages for temperatures all the way through, and then what they're looking at moving forward for most likely the next 10 days. After that, as I said, it becomes a little less predictable anyway. If you're more than 10 days out, then we turn to the Climate Prediction Center. In terms of the governing bodies really for issuing severe thunderstorm warnings, that comes from each individual National Weather Service office. So those guys who are in Romeoville looking at our severe thunderstorms, they're the ones issuing our warnings. But there's something called the Storm Prediction Center that's down in Norman, Oklahoma. All those boys are doing is looking at where we're going to see the severe storms in a day. And they're the ones that issue the slight risk, the marginal risk, the moderate risk, the enhanced risk, and the high risk. So if you ever see me say, or anybody else for that matter, that there's a high-risk zone across Chicagoland, that means that there will be tornadoes somewhere across that area, that it's a real high likelihood. So that's another thing that you can look at in terms of forecasting on if there's a chance of storms and we're in a moderate or enhanced or high risk, it's a pretty good chance we're going to see some action. Anybody else?
You mentioned global warming. Do you have a viewpoint on how that will affect the future occurrences of El Niños and La Niñas and the frequency of them?
I think what may happen with that, like we're in an ENSO neutral right now, which is a neutral path. So we don't really have a El Nino or a La Nina currently. So right now we're looking at the winter conditions being pretty neutral. But with global warming added into the equation, I don't know that we're going to see them fluctuate more rapidly, but what we will see is a stronger El Nino when it happens and a stronger La Nina when it happens. So if you have a weak El Nino, you'll see small effects globally. If you have a strong El Nino, you're going to see massive effects, and a strong La Nina, you're going to see massive effects across the country. So I think that will be more what we see. Everything, just kind of put everything on steroids. If you get a storm, it may be stronger. If you get a El Nino, it may be stronger. A La Nina, stronger. And then so every impact that we see weather-wise could be greater. I think for the last 4 or 5 years running, and it may be longer than that, globally, we have, as I said, had the warmest temperatures on record. And I hate sort of, it's hard for me because when you look at it just from a sheerly science perspective, you can kind of see the correlation and the ties, and you can see sort of looking forward what that could mean for us, but it gets super duper political, and it's uncomfortable for me because I'm not interested really in the politics of all that stuff, but just really in more so the science of it. But even that sometimes gets dicey, so you won't really often see us talk about that on the show at all because it just opens up a can of worms in not necessarily a good way. Lots of emails. Tons of emails. Yeah, we got a lot of weirdos. I mean, really, I had a guy one time in Miami. This is a weird story, but I'll tell you anyway. He was in jail, and he really liked me, so he would send me letters. But this is kind of before we did email like we do email now, or maybe they didn't have it in jail. I'm not sure. But he would send me like 18, 19, 20-page letters, which I never read because this is a crazy person who's sending me letters, and I don't want to read these. So apparently in one of them, he had put in the letter that if I wore blue anytime in the next month, that I would agree to marry him, which I was unaware of. So the next set of letters I got included a marriage certificate. we had to put a lockdown on that guy. Yeah, on that. Yeah. So the little weird stuff comes with the territory. Anybody have any other questions? Yeah.
What's the accuracy rate of the predictions?
That is interesting. Okay, for me it's difficult. I don't know. I don't know honestly our official rate. And it would probably be dependent on each individual meteorologist anyway. But the biggest issue for us is the fact that our area is on the larger side. First of all, we go all the way west out to Ottawa and all the way down to Kankakee, all the way up into Michigan in large part. So if I were to say there's a chance of rain and it's gonna rain, I may be right for 90% of the area, but not for 10% of the area.
Actually, I meant the national, when you mentioned the predictions.
Oh, right.
Right.
Okay.
That actually, now you can look back on the
They're pretty
years.
good.
They're pretty good?
They're pretty good. Yeah.
70%?
I would say. And so that would be the Climate Prediction Center. That's those guys. And that stuff that I showed you guys in terms of the precip and the temperatures, that is right smack dab on their website. So that's a fantastic resource to look at because that will tell you, not only does it tell you 1 month out and 3 months out, but it'll tell you for the next 8 days, the next 16 days. It'll get a little bit more detailed as well. So that's Climate Prediction Center. If you just Google that, it'll pop up. Climate Prediction Center is a great one. Hurricane Center, the Storm Prediction Center, all of those. There are official bodies. There's a U.S. drought monitor too that will tell you where we have the strongest drought conditions, and all these things are right there for everyone to look at now. I mean, we look at additional things and models and things that we have availability to in the Weather Center, but all that stuff's online now, and it's great. So I would suggest it, because that's the kind of stuff you're probably not going to hear. You're not going to see it on your iPhone, certainly, and you're probably not going to hear it when you turn on just the regular forecast on a day-to-day, because we don't have time. Usually they give me a minute 30 for my main weather, which means I have to take everybody through the current temperatures, satellite radar, forecast for the day, today, tonight, tomorrow, and all the way through the 7th day in a minute 30. And I like to talk, so it's never a minute 30. They get mad at me all the time. Rap, 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 rap. But that's okay. Tom Skilling, for the record, gets like 9 minutes. He really, do you notice that? Do you notice that, everyone? He shows every map there ever was, and he's got like 1 million minutes. I was his intern back in college. Nice guy. Does anyone else have any questions? No, we're good? Okay, well, feel free, my email is just mglaros@cbs.com. If you have any questions about those websites or where to find sort of that stuff for the Climate Prediction Center, just shoot me an email and I'll send you guys the links.
But no marriage proposal.
And no marriage proposal, no, That guy was crazy. He really was. I want to take a picture of you guys for my social media, and I'd like to show it on the show tomorrow too, if you guys don't mind. So you can, I'll just take a picture and then I'll do a quick little Instagram story, you know. All right, ready? I'll do this side, then that side. You know what? Can you take a picture so that I can come in it? All right, let's do this. It's important now. You know, they make us do social media. It's a big part of the job now. Everything changes. Okay, ready? Everybody wave. Okay, cool. So you pop in there and I'll take a quick Instagram. By the way, we're getting a new studio tomorrow in case anyone's going to be tuning in. We've been practicing all week. My part's legit. I'm good. I don't know about the rest of them. All right, ready? Everybody wave. Hi, guys. Okay. Excellent. Thank you all, by the way. It was really fun to come talk with you. I really appreciate it. And again, feel free to email me any questions you have. It's tough when it's such a broad topic to get into everything and anything, but just shoot me an email and I'll send you a link. Okay?